Hey, so do you know, like Wednesday, when you wouldn't leave me alone when I was making a video? You know, you had your headphones in and the Twitter thing. Well, can we not have that this time? I want to record a video this time, and I'd like it if you could go. Yeah, sure. All you had to do was ask. I don't see why you're making a big problem out of it. Right, so hey everyone and welcome back to another budget photography video. So, I was scrolling through my YouTube studio page and I saw that I hadn't made a certain video, and that's how cameras work. So in today's video I want to show you guys how a camera works. Now, the thing that led me on to looking for that kind of video was the fact that I dropped my Lumix GX7 into water and, well, it doesn't work anymore. It got very, very wet and it stopped working. So then I thought, have I done a video on how cameras work? And I was like, well, no, I haven't. So here it is. And I tore the camera down and put everything into a box apart from one thing, the camera image sensor. Now, the Lumix GX7 is a micro four thirds camera with 16 megapixels and it runs a CMOS sensor. Now, what is a image sensor? Well, if we go back to the early 90s, we used to have something called film. And how that works basically is it is light sensitive paper in a quick layman's terms. And how that would work was you would push your shutter button, a mirror within the camera would flip up, blocking the viewfinder temporarily, and while that mirror is locked up, the shutter behind the mirror would move up out of the way, exposing the film to light. Now, luckily these days we haven't got the complications of film, we have digital sensors, which means that we can pick and choose and manipulate our images to how we want them to be, whether that be in camera or post-processing in an editing app. What does an image sensor look like? Well, as I said, I tore down the Lumix GX7, and now remember, this is a micro four thirds sensor. So this is a very small sensor in comparison to the one you're watching me on now, which is a full frame 35mm sensor. But what is full frame? What is 35mm? Well, in a nutshell, full frame 35mm is basically the size of a film. So in a nutshell, a 35mm full frame camera, such as the 5D Mark II that I'm recording on, or the Canon EOS R5, they run on basically the same sensor. While yes, the R5 has got 45 megapixels and this only has 21. That's not the point. But the sizing of the sensor matters because they are the same size sensor. If you were to take the sensor out of this camera and compare it to a piece of film, they would be exactly the same size because, well, as it said, it's full frame. It fills the whole frame. So when I record on this 24-105, right now I'm recording at 50mm. I've zoomed in. So this is exactly what 50mm looks like. Whereas if I was to shoot on a crop censored camera, 50mm on the lens would actually be about 100mm, especially when you're talking about micro four thirds, because you have to times it by 2. Whereas with a crop censored camera, you have to times it by 1.5 for a Nikon or Sony and a 1.6 for Canon. I don't know why Canon does that, they just decided to do 1.6. So the 18 to 55mm kit lens wasn't actually 18 to 55. It was actually starting out at about 28mm. Now, what a lot of people often forget is the fact that you don't just have to times the millimeter, you have to times the aperture as well. So if you're dealing with something like this, which is an f4, on a crop censored camera, that would be an f8, which is pretty bad. So what does an image sensor look like? Well, this is the image sensor itself. I will put it up on screen properly now for you. And how this works is, in a way, like a piece of film, because it is sensitive to light. Now this image sensor is now knackered because I've exposed it to too much light, and all the connections on the back of the sensor have been torn off because, well, I don't know what I'm doing when I'm tearing down a camera. Now, when you have a camera, you will have two main things, the sensor and a lens. This is my 75-300. And how that actually works is you have the sensor a certain distance away from the back of the lens, and what that is actually called is the flange distance between the lens and the image sensor. Now, an image sensor, you can always find out how big the flange distance is and where the sensor is by a little mark, which is basically a circle with a line through it. And what that is signaling to you is where the image sensor is roughly in the camera. So you can estimate at how big the flange distance is going to be. Now, with a DSLR, a digital single lens reflex camera, the flange distance is a lot bigger because you have to take into consideration the space for the mirror and anything else that might need to be there. Now, with a mirrorless camera, you don't need a mirror because, well, it's a mirrorless camera. Now, mirrorless cameras are not a new thing. They have been around for quite a while, but they were always seen as the lesser of all of them. And then in 2013, the Sony A7s came out and changed the mirrorless game forever. And now majority of people are buying mirrorless cameras, whether that be from companies like Sony, Panasonic, or even Nikon, or even Canon with the Canon R5 and R6, which I'm debating whether or not to do a video about the R5 because I do quite like the specs, but there are problems. Anyway, so previously there wasn't any good full frame mirrorless cameras, if actually at all, because they just weren't very good. They weren't seen as very professional. And then, as I said, Sony came along and changed the game, and now every camera company since Sony has now started to go mirrorless. Nikon have got the Z range and Canon have got the R range. Now, there is a big debate as to whether or not mirrorless cameras will take over DSLRs. Now, that might be one day, yeah, but for now people will continue to buy DSLRs, mainly because they have good lenses. I'm not saying that mirrorless cameras don't have good lenses, because they do have good lenses. But the lenses for example, the Canon 5D Mark II, it has an EF mount, and there are hundreds of different lenses, whether that be first party or third party lenses. So example, Sigma lenses or Tamron or this, that and the other. I used to use a Tamron lens and it was one of my favourite lenses. Now, there is a massive price difference as well between mirrorless cameras and DSLRs. If you buy, for example, the R5, yes, this is going in at extremes. For the body alone, it is around £5,000, which is a hell of a lot of money for what it is. But the specs do kind of... Anyway, I'm going to go into that in another... I keep getting sidetracked by the R5 because I'm just amazed by... Anyway, for an example, this camera that I'm recording on right now, the 5D Mark II, cost me around £500. And then the lens that I've got on it cost me another £400. So that's £900 sat on a tripod, which is perfectly fine. But if I was to get the same kind of setup for another camera company with a mirrorless camera, it would cost me a lot more. And bearing in mind that you can also pick up a Canon 200D or 2000D, some of their entry-level stuff with two lenses for about £300. So DSLRs at the moment are the cheaper option, and especially with their still very good image sensors and just reliability. And then there are the professionals who are basically locked into the ecosystem, whether that be Canon or Nikon. You probably won't see a member of the press using a Sony A9 or an A7, purely because they've not got the glass. They have Canon glass, they have Nikon glass, they have this glass or that glass. So for now, the 1DX Mark III and the Nikons, I don't know what they're called, so I'm not going to say in case I just muck it all up. So for now, professionals will still use DSLRs, and DSLRs are still coming on leaps and bounds. We are still innovating with DSLRs. Now, yes, this one that I'm recording from is about 10 years old and it shoots 1080p, but the 1080p in this camera is just really nice. I was filming a video the other day for a client and I looked back at the footage and I was like, wow, that looks just nice. It just had a nice picture profile. Anyway guys, thanks for joining me in this video and I hope to see you in the next one.